Welcome back at the lecture number 3. So today I will be explaining the rest of the cranial bones that we didn't mention so far. So just to refresh your memory, I'll list again the cranial bones that are making up the skull, as well as the second part of the skull, that is the facial bones. Starting from the cranial bones, I said that it is made up with single as well as paired bones. The single ones are the frontal bone making up the forehead that we discussed last lecture. The parietal bones are actually the paired bones that we can find one on the right and one on the left side. Another paired bone is the temporal bone that we can find on the inferior lateral sides of the cranium, and on the posterior side we have the occipital bone that is not well seen on this diagram. Besides that, we have some bones that are located within the skull deep inside, such as the sphenoid bone, and we see just half of it from the outer side, and also we have the ethmoid bone that is not seen at this view at all. As for the rest of the skull, it is made up of the facial bones, and these facial bones we will discuss a little later once we finish the cranium. Now, today I will explain the temporal bone. And again, I will repeat that this is the paired bone, and it is having a complex shape. It has three major parts, as we see on this diagram. It has the squamous part, so this will be the squamous part of the temporal bone. It has the tympanic part. This will be the tympanic part of the temporal bone, and it has the petrous part as well. So this will be the petrous part. First, let me explain and start with the squamous part. The squamous part has the bone marking that is called the zygomatic process. Later in the facial bones, we will study the zygomatic bone that is making up the cheekbone. So this zygomatic process is connecting to the zygomatic bone on the facial part, and it is making up the arc. This zygomatic process projects anteriorly and meets the zygomatic bone, as I already mentioned. Besides this, on the squamous part of the temporal bone, we find the mandibular fossa. This is on the inferior surface, and this part receives the condylar process of the mandible, that is the lower jaw bone, and it forms the joint that is freely movable called temporomandibular joint or the jaw joint. Just to make it clear, in anatomy you'll be finding terms that are describing their function or their location, etc. For example, the temporomandibular joint. It will be in between the temporal bone and the mandible. Also, the zygomatic process. It will be in between the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. So pay attention to the terms and pay attention to the namings while studying the anatomy. Also, we have the tympanic part. This is the tympanic part of the temporal bone that is surrounding the external acoustic meatus. This is the external acoustic meatus. Just let me make it more clear. Just a second. So this is the tympanic part that is surrounding the external acoustic meatus. And this external acoustic meatus is the external air canal. So here we have the ear, and the sounds are passing through this canal actually. So these were the squamous and the tympanic parts of the temporal bone. If you continue with an petrous part, petrous, this is kind of rocky part of the temporal bone. It continues to the and continues and forms the cranial base. So when we look from the inferior view of the skull, we see the cranial base. Now, what we can find on the petrous part of the temporal bone, so this will be the petrous part of the temporal bone, not fully, just let me clear this. So this will be the petrous part of the temporal bone. So here we find a few openings or foramen. Starting from the large one, we have the jugular foramen, This is the jugular foramen that can be found where the petrous part joins the occipital bone. So this on the brownish color is the occipital bone that is making up the most posterior part of the skull. So in between the temporal and the occipital bone, we find the jugular foramen. This is for the jugular vein that will be draining the deoxygenated blood from the skull, and this vein will be passing from this foramen. Again, I'll refresh your mind that the foramen is opening. Then we have the foramen lacerum. This is the foramen lacerum of the petrous part of the temporal bone, but more precisely, it can be found between the medial part of the petrous, medial tip of the petrous part of temporal bone and the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone, this is a purple bone that is found here and that I'll explain in a few minutes. Also, we find the internal acoustic meatus that is from the inner side and not seen well from this part. So it is the part of the petrous part of the temporal bone that is continuation of the external acoustic meatus. So simply to imagine, this is the external acoustic meatus that is continuing into the internal acoustic meatus with an internal acoustic meatus. Also, we find the styloid process. So this will be the styloid process. Here, this is the styloid process. And that styloid process, no, I'm sorry. Just a second. That was a mastoid. So this is the styloid process. That is needle-shaped projection from the petrous part of the temporal bone. It is running from the inferior side of the temporal bone. Lateral and posterior to the styloid process, we have the prominence, that is the mastoid process. So this is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. This mastoid process contains air-filled sinuses that are called the mastoid air cells. And the last that we find, the last opening, this is the stylomastoid foramen in between the styloid and the mastoid processes. So here we have the stylomastoid foramen, and it is again for one of the cranial nerves to exit the skull through this opening. Next, we continue with an occipital bone. Occipital bone is making up the back of the head, so this will be the occipital bone. Again, to refresh your memory, the occipital bone is connected to the parietal bones by the lambdoid suture and to the temporal bones by the occipitomastoid suture. We have the external features of the occipital bone, that will be the external occipital protuberance. So this is the external occipital protuberance. It is found at the junction of the base and the posterior wall of the skull. We have external occipital crest that will be extending. That will be extending anteriorly from the protuberance to the foramen magnum. Here we have the foramen magnum that I will explain in a few minutes. This external occipital crest is securing the ligaments of the neck, named the ligamentum nuchae. And laterally from the occipital protuberance, we have the superior and inferior nuchal lines. And these are for the muscles, neck and the back muscles, to be attached at this point. If we look from the base of the occipital bone, so this is the base of the occipital bone, here we will find the foramen magnum, as I already mentioned. This foramen magnum literally means the big hole or large hole. This is for the spinal cord that will be passing through this opening. We know that in the skull we have the brain located deep inside, and the continuation of the brain is the spinal cord. So this large hole ensures the connection of the brain and the spinal cord so that they will not be interruptible. Besides this, on the lateral side of the foramen magnum, we find the rocker-like condyles that are called the occipital condyles on both sides. These are used to articulate with the first cervical vertebra. Then medial and superior to each occipital condyle, we find the hypoglossal canal. So the hypoglossal canal can be found from here, like it's better seen. So this is the hypoglossal canal in between not between, but anteriorly and medially and superiorly to the occipital condyles. Also, anterior to the foramen magnum, we find the continuation of the sphenoid bone. So this is the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone, and it is making up the basilar part of the occipital bone. And internally, the occipital bone forms the walls of the posterior cranial fossa, which is holding the part of the brain that is called cerebellum. So the skull is divided into three fossas. We have the anterior fossa, this one. We have the middle fossa, this one. And the posterior fossa, again, which is made up with an occipital bone. Now to continue with the sphenoid bone, I mentioned it in a few times. So what is the sphenoid bone? This is the wedge-shaped bone, and that is purple on this diagram, and I'll color now it in blue. So this is the sphenoid bone, and actually it is located at the cranial floor, and it resembles a bat because it has wings that are spread out. It is a keystone bone that forms the central wedge of the cranium, and it articulates with every other cranial bones. So you can see that it articulates with the frontal bone, with the ethmoid bone, with temporal, occipital bones, as well as from the anterior side, we see it's participating in formation of the orbital cavity. And now, what do we have? I will just go to the next slide. So this is the sphenoid bone separated. And which parts of the sphenoid bone do we have? We have the body, which is blue in this diagram. And we have the three pairs of processes. We have the greater rings. These reddish are the greater rings. I'll just color it on one side. It has the lesser rings. This green one is the lesser ring. And also it has the pterygoid processes. So this will be the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. Now, on the body of the sphenoid bone, we have a saddle-shaped prominence that is called the sella turcica. So here, this is the sella turcica, and that is having saddle shape. And just let me clear this. This will be making up the anterior part of the saddle, and this will be making up the posterior part of the saddle. And in between, we have the fossa, and this fossa is called the hypophyseal fossa because it holds the pituitary gland that is also called the hypophysis. Within this sphenoid bone body, it contains the sphenoid sinuses. Again, the sinuses are air-filled cavities found within the bone. This was about the body of the sphenoid bone. Now let me continue with the greater rings. The greater rings are making up the middle cranial fossa, as well as the orbit. The horn-shaped lesser rings form the part of the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and part of the orbit. As for the pterygoid processes, pterygoid means wing-like. So these processes are projecting inferiorly from the greater wings, and these processes have the medial and the lateral plates, and they are attachment sites for the pterygoid muscles, and those muscles are helping to close the jaw while chewing, and they're named respectively, like we have the medial pterygoid and the lateral pterygoid muscles that are chewing muscles. Now, to continue with the important openings that we can find on the sphenoid bone, first I will start with an optic canal. This is the optic canal that lies just anterior to the sella turcica. So again, like this is the sella turcica, and anterior to it on both sides, we find the optic canal at the junction of the body of the sphenoid and the lesser wings of the sphenoid. Besides that, we have other 4 openings that are lying just lateral to the sphenoid bones. Lateral to the body of the sphenoid bone. The most anterior opening is the largest, and this is called the superior orbital fissure. You can see that it is not a hole, but it is the fissure, which is like elongated opening. It is a long slit, simply to say, in between the greater and the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. Besides that, we have the foramen rotundum, that is the round hole or round opening lying in the medial part of the greater wing, and we have the foramen ovale, that is the oval shape hole posterolateral to the foramen rotundum, and the most posteriorly we have the foramen spinosum, that is the spiral-shaped foramen posterolateral to the foramen ovale. So these are important openings on the sphenoid bone that we can find. And why they're important? Because later on the next semester you will study the nervous system, you will study the brain that is located into the cranium, and you will study the cranial nerves which are arising from the brain. And actually those cranial nerves are passing through these openings. For example, into the optic canal, we have the optic nerve passing into the superior orbital fissure. We have a few cranial nerves passing here that are connected to the movement of the eye. We have the trigeminal nerve, branch of the trigeminal nerve passing to the foramen ovale and to the foramen rotundum, as well as the foramen spinosum. So these are the openings that you have to remember as a skeletal part in this semester, and the next semester you will add the nervous part that will be passing through these openings. Now let me continue with an ethmoid bone. Today I mentioned ethmoid bone as well. And just to reorient where this ethmoid bone is located, like this is the anterior cranial fossa, and on the lateral side we see the frontal bone, and this is the ethmoid bone. So this is the ethmoid bone where we find it. So it is the most deeply situated bone of the skull, lying just anterior to the sphenoid bone and posterior to the nasal bone. Its superior surface is formed by the paired horizontal plates, so this will be the horizontal plates, that are called the cribriform plate. Cribriform means perforated like a sieve. So you can see that it is having like lots of small openings or like dot-like openings, and that's why it is called the cribriform. And this cribriform plate contributes the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, as I already mentioned, as well as it is making up the roof of the nasal cavity. These openings, the tiny openings that we find on the cribriform plate, are called the cribriform foramina. Between the two cribriform plate, we have a superior projection that is called the crista galli. It is better seen from the anterior view as well as posterior. So this is like projection, and this crista galli literally means rooster's comb, and it is the place where the fibrous membrane that are covering the brain and that are called the falx cerebri. So this membrane is attaching to the crista galli, and it helps to secure the brain within the cranial cavity. As for the perpendicular plate, now let me clear this. As for the perpendicular plate that we have of the sphenoid bone, of the ethmoid bone, it is projecting inferiorly in the medial plane, and it forms the superior part of the nasal septum. So on each side of the perpendicular plate, there is a delicate ethmoid labyrinth And this ethmoid labyrinth, like we see here on the lateral masses, so these are the ethmoid labyrinth. They contain the ethmoid air cells, making up the ethmoid sinus. Again, this is air-filled cavity that can be found within the bone. Extending medially from the ethmoid labyrinth, there are thin medial and superior and middle nasal conchae. We find here, so this is the superior nasal conchae, and this is the medial nasal conchae. They are kind of wave-shaped structures that are increasing the surface area. As for the lateral surface of the labyrinth, we have the orbital plate, and because they're contributing to the orbital to form the medial wall of the orbit. Now, let me continue and like show the other picture. So this is again the lateral view where we find this perpendicular plate. First of all, this will be the horizontal plate, that will be the cribriform plate with its openings. Those openings are carrying the olfactory nerve fibers that are for smelling. So like these nerves are entering into the skull through this opening. And as I said, the perpendicular plate is making up the superior part of the nasal septum. So this is the nose, the nasal cavity, and this is the superior part of the nasal septum, making up the made of with a perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, as for the superior nasal concha, this is the superior nasal concha, and this is the middle nasal concha, making up the wave-like projections, as we can see better on this picture. So these are the wave-like projections that will be increasing the surface area on the or in the nasal cavity. And here the orbital plates that will be making up the medial wall of the orbit. So actually, I finished to explain the all the cranial bones so far, and again to refresh your memory and to summarize all the cranial bones, I'll just quickly pass through these bones that we can find at the skull and their main bone markings. So starting from the frontal bone, again, I'll repeat that it is making up the forehead part of the skull that we can see here. Inside of the frontal bone, we have the frontal sinuses, which are part of the paranasal sinuses. Again, paranasal are the sinuses around the nasal cavity. And which features we can find at the frontal bone, and I will be highlighting. So we find the supraorbital margin, we find the supraorbital foramen, and we find the glabella of the frontal bone. As for the frontal squama, this is the anterior flattened part of the frontal bone. As for the parietal bone and the connection in between the frontal and the parietal bone, this will be the coronal suture. And parietal bones are paired bones making up the superior wall of the lateral cranium. Inferiorly, it is joined to the temporal bone by the squamous suture, and posteriorly, it is joined to the occipital bone by the lambdoid suture. As for the right and the left side of the parietal bones, they're connected by the sagittal suture to each other. And the parietal bone does not have any specific bone markings to be mentioned. As for the occipital bone, it is forming the most posterior part of the cranial cavity as well as the cranial fossa. And features that we find on the cranial, on the occipital bone, the main one is the foramen magnum, the large hole that is continuation, like it enables the brain to continue into the spinal cord without interruption. On lateral sides of the occipital bone, we find the occipital condyles for attachment of the to the first cervical vertebra. Then we find the external occipital protuberance, and actually it is very protruded part of the bone. So if you will touch your posterior side of the skull, like the occipital part of the skull, the most projected part that you will feel, and I'm sure that most of you will find this part, this is the external occipital protuberance. From there we have the external occipital crest, and lateral to the occipital protuberance we have the superior and inferior knuckle lines. As for the connection of the occipital bone to the parietal, I already mentioned this is by the lambdoid suture, and its connection to the temporal bone is by the occipitomastoid sutures. Anteriorly, anteriorly the occipital bone articulates with the sphenoid bone, and this part is making up the basal part of the cranium. Next, we have the temporal bone that are again paired bones connected to the parietal bone by the squamous suture, and to the occipital bone by the occipitomastoid suture. And the parts of the temporal bone, we have the squamous region, we have the petrous region, we have the tympanic region, and the bone markings, important bone markings that we can find here. These are the these are the zygomatic process that connects the temporal bone to the zygomatic bone. We have the mandibular fossa that will be articulating or forming the joint within mandible. We have the external acoustic meatus that is internally continued as an internal acoustic meatus, and actually in between we find the acoustic canal. So just to imagine, this is the internal acoustic meatus, this is the external acoustic meatus, which is larger, and in between we have the canal. So this will be the canal passing through the bone, the temporal bone. Okay. Next we have the styloid process that is like needle-shaped, this needle-shaped process projecting inferiorly, and we have the mastoid process as well. This mastoid process is filled with an air, making up the mastoid air cell, making up the mastoid sinus. So this is the inferior view, and we see from here the mandibular fossa, the zygomatic arch, the tympanic part containing the external acoustic meatus and the internal acoustic meatus, and the another openings that we find in between junction of the bones. This will be, just let me clear this. This will be the jugular foramen, that is large one in between the temporal and the occipital bone. Also, we find a carotid opening that is the for the internal carotid artery to pass and enter into the skull. And also we have the foramen lacerum, or in another way to say, this is the lacerated foramen that allows the passage of the small blood vessels and the nerves to the skull. And next we have the sphenoid bone, the bed-shaped bone. This bed-shaped bone is having different parts. It has the body, which contains the air cells, making up the sphenoid sinus. It has the lesser rings, it has the greater rings, and it has the pterygoid process. And the major openings that we find and the bone markings that we find at the sphenoid bone, this will be the sella turcica with its hypophyseal fossa. It has the optic canals. It has the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum, as well as it has a superior orbital fissure that is not well seen, but like here we have the superior orbital fissure. And finally, the ethmoid bone, that is like most deep bone on the skull. It is having the perpendicular plate. This will be the perpendicular plate as well as the horizontal plate. The horizontal plate called the cribriform plate with its cribriform foramen, and the superior projection from there we have the crista galli. As for the perpendicular plate, we have the nasal conchae arising from here, middle and the superior nasal conchae, as well as on the lateral side we have the lateral masses of the ethmoid bone that contains the air cells making up the ethmoid sinus, and the most superior part of the lateral mass is called the orbital plate. I'm sorry, that is contributing information of the orbital cavity. So this summarizes all the cranial bones and the topic which I wanted to explain for today. If you will have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to ask me or your teacher during the seminar, and we will further explain it. Thank you.